Hello, everybody. Corinne Smith back again with another exciting episode in the series where I talk about resources that you can use to study the life and writings of American author and naturalist Henry David Thoreau. This is episode 8. How about that? And today's topic is collections of Thoreau's poems. Poems? What? Henry was a poet too? Was there no end to his range of talents? No. But of course, a case could be made that Henry's prose was often poetic. In fact, it was maybe even more poetic than his formal poems. So we'll get to that in a minute. My name's Corinne Smith. I was a librarian for many years, and in the last 20 years specifically, I've researched a lot about Henry David Thoreau, written a couple of books about him, and currently I serve as the supervisor of the Thoreau Society shop at Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. This is my own series. It's my own perspective of the history and the scope of these publications based on the fact that I use them and a lot in many cases. And when I mention a book on here, it's going to be on a bibliography on my website, travelswiththoreau.com. Each episode has its own bibliography, and you just click on bibliographies and then you'll see. You'll see. And the links are to a variety of places, depending on whether the book is in print or out of print. Okay, so there are used book dealer site links there as well. Now, about Thoreau's poems. My last episode was about his essays, and one of those essays is titled Herald of Freedom. You may never have read it. Herald of Freedom was the name of an anti-slavery newspaper in New Hampshire at the time, and this essay was Thoreau's positive review of both the paper and its editor, Nathaniel Peabody Rogers, who was the head of the paper for 8 years. Thoreau praised Rogers' writings and his writing style, and he added this comment: "There was beside more unpledged poetry in his prose than in the verses of many an accepted rhymer, and we were occasionally advertised by a mellow hunter's note from his trumpet that, unlike most reformers, his feet were still where they should be, on the turf, and that he looked out from a serener natural life into the turbid arena of politics." Wow, that's Henry and his love of metaphor. In other words, this guy's prose reads like poetry, and he keeps his feet on the ground. He keeps a firm grasp on reality. Couldn't we say the same exact thing about Henry himself? Couldn't he be talking about himself? Let me read the description again. I love it. "There was beside more unpledged poetry in his prose than in the verses of many an accepted rhymer, and we were occasionally advertised by a mellow hunter's note from his trumpet that, unlike most reformers, his feet were still where they should be, on the turf, and that he looked out from a serener natural life into the turbid arena of politics." Wow, yes. Then, listen to what Henry says in the Friday chapter of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. Here he also addresses the differences between poetry and prose. "Some poems are for holidays only. They are polished and sweet, but it is the sweetness of sugar, and not such as toil gives to sour bread. The breath with which the poet utters his verse must be that by which he lives. Great prose of equal elevation commands our respect more than great verse, since it implies a more permanent and level height, a life more pervaded with the grandeur of the thought. The poet often only makes an eruption, like a Parthian, and is off again, shooting while he retreats. But the prose writer has conquered like a Roman and settled colonies. The true poem is not that which the public read. There is always a poem not printed on paper, coincident with the production of this, stereotyped in the poet's life. It is," and he emphasizes this in italics, "it is what he has become through his work. Not how is the idea expressed in stone or on canvas on paper is the question, but how far it has obtained form and expression in the life of the artist. His true work will not stand in any prince's gallery. And he follows that up with a couplet that you probably know of his own. My life has been the poem I would have writ, but I could not both live and utter it. True enough. And then he follows that one up with a 3-verse poem called The Poet's Delay. It's in the Friday chapter of a week. So you can always tell, by the way, when Henry is using his own verse in a Walden or a week, and when he's quoting other people. When he's quoting other poems for other people, he always uses quote marks at the beginning and the end. He rarely gives full attribution, though. So he leaves it up to future annotators to explain who and where the quotes came from and why they even apply. But he does use quotes for other people's poetry. If there's no quote marks, then he wrote the poem. The poem is his. So prose, poetry, let's agree up front that Henry's prose does indeed read like poetry. But like I said, in a week and in Walden, he includes a number of his own poems. And like some of us, he was more apt to write poetry when he was younger. What kind of poetry did Thoreau write? Mostly free verse, sometimes with archaic vocabulary, which was certainly still a style of the day, sometimes with odd rhymes, if he rhymed at all. Here's an example of an interesting rhyme. Great God, I ask thee for no meaner pelf than that I may not disappoint myself. Pelf is a word, by the way, and it means wealth or money or ill-gotten gains. Great God, I ask thee for no meaner pelf than that I may not disappoint myself. When's the last time you heard that word, other than 20 seconds ago? And it's not that's not the only instance of him using that word. It's a great rhyme, pelf and self, but you have to explain it to some people, probably. Here is another poem called On the Sun Coming Out in the Afternoon. Okay, the sun's coming out in the afternoon. It's an example of iambic pentameter. You know what iambic pentameter is, right? Okay, brief English lesson. An iamb consists of 2 syllables, and the accent's on the second one, da-da, da-da. You put 5 of them together, you get iambic pentameter. Da-da, 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 da-da. It's a familiar rhythm, especially to English language speakers. Shakespeare wrote his plays in iambic pentameter. Sonnets are written in iambic pentameter usually. So here's the rose. On the sun coming out in the afternoon. It's only 4 lines long. Methinks all things have traveled since you shined, but only time and clouds time's team have moved. Again, foul weather shall not change my mind, but in the shade I will believe what in the sun I loved. Iambic pentameter for the first 3 lines, and then the 4th one, not so much. He breaks free of the anticipated pacing in that last line. And you know, we probably should anticipate this from a transcendentalist, a nonconformist, a truly American writer. I mean, why would you follow the rules based on a European format? Why? He also uses an I rhyme here, or a sight rhyme, because he tries to rhyme moved with loved. And on the page, they look like they rhyme. But, you know, when you say them out loud, obviously they don't. So he uses sight rhymes. He also at least one point, rhymes faith with saith. Again, they look like they rhyme on the paper. As near as I can tell, he only wrote 2 sonnets. This is my Karnak, whose unmeasured dome. Don't be thinking of Johnny Carson with that. Some people will know what I mean. And the moon moves up her smooth and sheeny path. Of course she does. The moon moves up her smooth and sheeny path. That's a great start to a sonnet. And both of these sonnets start in iambic pentameter, but by the end, they again break away and just, you know, do whatever he wants to do. Now there are poems where Henry adheres to consistent beats and consistent rhyming patterns. The sonnets are not those, but obviously he didn't always feel the need to conform to an established poetic format every single time he wanted to express something. So good for him, I say. Good for him. So now my favorite poem, of course, some people know this, appears in the Sounds chapter of Walden. What's the railroad to me? I never go to see where it ends. It fills a few hollows and makes banks for the swallows. It sets the sand a-blowing and the blackberries a-growing. Yeah. By the way, I can tell you probably by the time he wrote those lines, and definitely by the time they appeared in Walden, published in 1854, those first lines weren't even true. What's the railroad to me? I never go to see where it ends. By the early 1850s, he had traveled by train a lot, and he had ridden to the end of quite a number of railroad lines in New England. But it's still a nice little ditty to read in Walden and to read out loud. What's the railroad to me? I never go to see where it ends. As you know, Henry was a lover of metaphor and simile and analogy, and you will find lots of them in these verses. And one of the first poems that Thoreauvians usually come across is known as Sikh Vita, with life, in which he describes himself. And it's early, and he's a young person. And he could have just said, hey, I'm a young person. I've got all these different emotions and ambitions. But no, he says, I am a parcel of vain strivings tied by a chance bond together, dangling this way and that. Their links were made so loose and wide, methinks, for milder weather. Okay. And he equates himself with a bouquet of wildflowers being put into a vase. And here I bloom for a short hour unseen, drinking my juices up, with no root in the land to keep my branches green, but stand in a bare cup. Wow. Okay. Thoreau had at least 15 poems published in issues of the Dial in the early 1840s. Others, as I mentioned, he wove into the texts of A Week and Walden. And then after he was gone, a few of his poems appeared in Atlantic Monthly and the Boston Commonwealth. And it's said that when he showed some of his poetry to Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great man advised Henry to throw them away because they weren't any good. And I guess he may have done this. Oh well, some of them remain, enough of them remain for us to find and to talk about. Now, where will you find his poetry? We're going to start historically, as we always do, and then work our way up to what you can get today. Some of these resources are ones I've mentioned in other episodes. Most of them are out of print, but you can find used copies of them. And we start in 1865 with Emerson and his compilation called Letters to Various Persons. Looked like this, okay? Looked like this. That's both the same book, just different styles of binding. Letters by H.D. Thoreau is what it said on the spine, but the real title was Letters to Various Persons. It was the first correspondence volume of Thoreau's correspondence. Contained 65 letters, but also 9 poems. So ironically, Emerson started the trend of adding poems to other works. And then, as you know, in 1893, we get the 11-volume set of the Riverside Writings of Thoreau. And volume 10 is Miscellanies. Can you see that? Miscellanies up at the top, hoping. The 10th volume is Miscellanies, and it contains, there's Miscellanies, and it contains 11 essays, but also 10 poems. Then, of course, the Mother Lode, 1906. What do we have in 1906? The 20-volume set from Houghton Mifflin of the Writings of Henry David Thoreau. 20-volume set where the last 14, of course, are what? The journal. Volume 5 is Excursions and Poems, right there. Has 9 essays, 2 translations, all of A Yankee in Canada, which I've discussed before, and 22 poems. See, excursions and poems. So we're getting more with each volume. Now, in addition to those classic sets that I've talked about a lot, there are also a couple of individual books that came out, and one of them came out in 1895, and that's when Frank Sanborn and Henry Salt teamed up to create a book called Poems of Nature. Looked like this. Actually, it says Thoreau's Poems. It's only one volume. Again, these are two different versions. It says Thoreau's Poems on the side, but reality, the title was called Poems of Nature. Sanborn and Salt teamed up for this. Frank Sanborn, of course, was an educator and a writer who lived in Concord and had known the Transcendentalists himself. Henry Salt was a social reformer and a vegetarian and an early Thoreau fan based in England. He also wrote the first outsider biography of Thoreau, shall we say. The two men corresponded by letter. They also met at least once when Sanborn went over to England. Henry Salt, I don't think, ever came over here. They put together this Poems of Nature, which was the first volume to be exclusively Thoreau's poetry. And they chose to include 50 poems in this book in 1895. In their introduction, they explain, and I have a feeling Henry Salt wrote the introduction. If you know Frank Sanborn's writing and you know Frank Sanborn has a challenging reputation among Thoreauvians, shall we say. If you look at this introduction to Poems of Nature, which you can do on Google Books, I think Henry Salt wrote it. It doesn't sound like Sanborn, thankfully. Anyway, they chose 50 poems for their book. They said in the introduction that this represented about 2/3 of what they thought Henry's poetry amounted to. So they figured there were about 75 freestanding poems. They didn't think fragments counted, and they didn't count the ones, I don't think, printed in a week and in Walden. So they were kind of specific about what they chose. And then, of course, Sanborn can't leave well enough alone. 1907, he teamed up with Curtis Hidden Page and produced a limited edition publication, very tiny, thin, only a couple of pages long, called Unpublished Poems by Bryant and Thoreau. This was for the Bibliophile Society, which Sanborn had connections with. Only 470 copies were printed, contained just a few pages, and 2 poems, Musings by William Cullen Bryant and Godfrey of Boulogne by Henry David Thoreau. Why Godfrey of Boulogne? Who knows? It was literary. It followed conventional format. Anyway, that was a specialty book for Sanborn, and he could take pride in that. He had not included Godfrey of Boulogne in Poems of Nature because, of course, that was Poems of Nature, and it wasn't about historical figures from more than 1,000 years ago. Then, of course, as the decades passed, Thoreau's literary reputation grew stronger and stronger through the early part of the 20th century, and then we reached the key Thoreau scholars in the middle of the 1900s, and one of them, Carl Bodie, compiled a book in 1943 called Collected Poems of Henry Thoreau. Used to have a nice dust jacket on it. Collected Poems of Henry Thoreau, 1943. 200 poems. 200. Okay, here we have another example of a later scholar coming along and say, you know, I don't like what those guys did. And he specifically says that politely in the introduction. He did not agree that there were only 75 poems. Obviously, he put 200 in here. And this is a very nice introduction in his book in which he says there are 3 basic reasons why people ignore Thoreau's poetry. Number 1, it has an uneven quality, which is a polite way of saying some of it is good and some of it not so much. Number 2, Henry himself lost interest in writing in verse as he got older. And number 3, it was accepted that the poems that he included in A Week in Walden were part of those greater narratives and they could not be separated from them. And Bodhi basically says that's nonsense. I paraphrase, but he says no. So his collected poems include 200, including What's the Railroad to Me, including Sikh Vita, including Godfrey of Boulogne. And in 1964, this was 1943, in 1964, he came out with an expanded edition of the collected poems of Henry Thoreau, first in hardback with an exact dust jacket like this one, and then in paperback, which is what my copy is. And they're both out of print, but really they are the only books solely devoted to Thoreau's poetry, other than Poems of Nature, and that do the most complete job solely to the poetry. And Carl Bodie's introduction is worth reading, even today. Now, this is usually the place where I start talking about Princeton editions. And those are the ones that go back to his original manuscripts and print the way it was and tell about differences between publications. Well, guess what? There is no Princeton edition of Thoreau's poetry. What? They're not addressing it at all. Actually, Carl Bodie included notes about the manuscripts and the publications in the back of his collected poem volumes. So really, he already did what the Princeton edition folks would have done if they would have addressed it. So if you are merely collecting all the Princeton volumes because that's what you want, great. You're going to miss out on Henry's poetry, except for the ones that are in his books. So if that's the case, grab one of Bodie's collected poems also, either the original from 1940 or the 1960s. Oh, the expanded edition, forgot to say, has about 12 more poems in it. So not so much, but so it has 212 in the expanded edition. Now, in the past, I've always talked about the portable Thoreaus too. The one from Carl Bodie, which was early on, and then the one from Jeff Kramer, which is 2012. Yeah, not so long ago. The older one, again, by Carl Bodie, includes 18 poems along with everything else, Walden and everything else. The newer one includes 21 poems. So there's small sampling in each one. So if you just want a small sampling, then that's what you get. And I have also previously mentioned the Library of America. In the hardback, they have 2 Thoreau volumes. One has A Week, Walden, Maine Woods, Cape Cod, I think. Second one has collected essays and poems. I talked about this one last time. And then they also have a paperback edition that has Walden, the Maine Woods, and collected essays and poems, sort of a merging of the best of the 2 hardback volumes. Okay, both of these have 203 poems in them, almost as many as Carl Bodie did in his standalone volume, okay? But you're not going to get any explanation, and you're not going to get his wonderful introduction. So if you just want the poems, yeah, sure. I like these volumes. I like this one especially. This is only $17.95. The other one's $40. Yeah. So those are possibilities if you want to get as much as you can. Okay. Let me take a pause here. So how did you know that there was this much stuff to talk about with Thoreau's poetry? Now, if you want something prettier, shall we say, something maybe for your coffee table, then you should look to used book dealers for The Poet's Delay, a collection of poetry by America's greatest observer of nature. It's a coffee table book produced by the art publisher Rizzoli, pairs lovely artwork with 52 of Thoreau's poems. Obviously, Winslow Homer. There's also John Singer Sargent, also all kinds of different things. So 52 poems illustrated, okay? All kinds of different illustrations, different kinds of people from a major museum. And so this is really nice. 52 poems with beautiful pictures. It includes What's the Railroad to Me? I never go to see where it ends. Not exactly sure I would have paired it with that, but okay. Does not include Sikh Vita. No vain strivings here. By the way, unfortunately, they misspell Beth Witherall's name twice on the acknowledgements page. Oh well, sorry. This was put together by art people and not Thoreauvian people. Still beautiful, still beautiful. And I highly recommend it. Out of print, got to go to a used book dealer. Now, if you might want a coffee table book that illustrates Thoreau's poetry, but that also includes some journal entries and some book passages, plus some interpretation too, then you go to a used book dealer and you look for The Winged Life, the poetic voice of Henry David Thoreau, edited and with commentaries by master American author and poet Robert Bly, and illustrated with the now classic wood engravings of Michael McCurdy. A great pairing, a great pairing. Look at that, look at that. This is another nice book. 42 poems, 62 prose passages, divided up into 5 themes. Robert Bly talks about what he does with these, and each new section starts with a Michael McCurdy woodcut. Some of these will be familiar to you, some perhaps not. It again includes What's the Railroad to Me? And again, no vain strivings. I don't know why. I think that's a poem you could illustrate well. There's an assignment for you. Find a relevant illustration for Sikh Vita, the Vain Strivings poem, or make your own. Now, somewhat tangentially, some folks have gone beyond the traditional scope of connecting Henry David Thoreau with poetry. And they have found some unique ways of doing this. Here is Sweet Wild World, selections from the journals arranged as poetry by William M. White from 1982. It's exactly what it says. Entries from Thoreau's journals, but printed in free verse form. Okay, so, and with illustrations by Georgia Dearborn. Printed in free verse form, giving credence to what I said at the beginning, that Henry's prose is often more poetic than his actual poems are. Haha. And these excerpts, these poems, well, they're not poems, they're excerpts from the journal that look like poems, and they are arranged by season, summer to spring, just like Walden is arranged summer to spring. Sweet Wild World. Again, out of print, get it from a used book dealer. Now, let me show the cover of the next one I want to talk about, and that is Walden by Haiku by Ian Marshall. Okay, in it, Ian presents almost 300 haiku that he extracted and gleaned from Walden. Okay, now, Thoreau never encountered the form of haiku himself. He obviously never deliberately set out to write in that kind of form, but Ian Marshall has found instances in Walden that are haiku-like, almost 300 of them, and that's what this book is. It's quite an interesting observation, actually. By the way, and this is still in print. By the way, Ian is a professor at the Altoona campus of Penn State University, and he and his students also built a replica of Thoreau's Walden House on their campus. And so here is a photo of their Walden House. It's quite interesting because they have benches built in all the way around the window, all the way around the outline of the house inside. It's kind of interesting. And then here's another unique book. Here's the cover of another unique book. Thoreau, Voice in the Edgeland, a biography in sonnets by Langley Carlton Keyes, or Keyes. I have a feeling it's Keyes. Now, you know, it's difficult enough to write a biography of someone who's famous and who has had a lot of other people write about him. But to do it in sonnets, are you kidding me? Henry didn't even write a complete and formal sonnet himself. Again, it's an interesting approach. I've seen this book in used bookstores from time to time. I've never been moved to buy a copy of it, but that's what it looks like. And there are still copies out there in used book dealers. So there's another assignment for you. Write a biography of somebody famous, but do it only in sonnets or some kind of other poetry. Good luck with that. But Langley Carlton Keyes, or Keyes, it probably is, was on to something because a fair number of people have been inspired and influenced enough by Henry David Thoreau to write poetry. Poems about him, poems about Walden Pond, about Concord, about his relationship with nature, how he saw things, and more. And it started, of course, with himself, and then, a couple of autobiographical poems about vain strivings, but then also with his good friend Ellery Channing, who wrote several poems about Henry, and one of them was featured at Thoreau's memorial service at the First Parish Church in 1862. And I have to say that I myself have not escaped this trend to write poems about Henry or about Walden. I don't know, I've written maybe 5, 8, probably no more than 10 so far. Sometimes you just get inspired, especially if you're walking around the pond. But sometimes you get inspired just by seeing other things and knowing that he saw them too. I digress. So one of my poems actually appears in my book about his 1861 trip to Minnesota, Westward I Go Free, tracing Thoreau's last journey. It's in chapter 13. And in chapter 13, I include an original poem about the woman that he met on the steamboat as he was steaming down the Mississippi River from Minnesota, there's my poem over here, from Minnesota to Wisconsin, late June 1861. So that's one. I was also a contributor to Thoreau at Mackinac, Selected Writings of Henry David Thoreau with Poetry and Prose from Mackinac Island. This book was published by the Mackinac Arts Council in 2017 to celebrate Henry's bicentennial, also to celebrate the fact that on the way back from Minnesota, he spent almost a week on Mackinac Island. And so, so I have a poem in here. My Thoreauvian colleagues, Jeff Hinich and Tammy Rose, have poems in here too, as does master Midwestern poet Jim Lefeste. So thanks, Mackinac Arts Council. Now, another poet who has been influenced by Henry is David K. Leff of Connecticut. And he's written several travelogues where he follows some of Thoreau's geographical paths. He's written Deep Pass in Thoreau's wake on Concord and Merrimack, and Canoeing Maine's legendary Allagash, Thoreau, Romance and Survival of the Wild. These are narratives, geographical travelogue narratives, not poems, or they're memoirs, not poems. But in recent years, David has also been gathering tribute poems to Thoreau. And he has been looking for as many as he can find, both published by famous people and by you and me. He estimates that there might be as many as 500 to 600 poems out there that people have written about Henry, inspired by Henry, probably more than written about any other non-religious figure in history. And so David is busy compiling an anthology of about 50 of the poems that he has found, beginning with the autobiographical ones that Henry wrote about, and then coming along and into the 21st century. The book will be published by Homebound Publications in late 2021 or early 2022, and it will be called A Gathering of Poets on Henry David Thoreau, Verse Inspired by His Life and Work. David says that the featured poems include some by Pulitzer Prize winners, Nobel laureates, a poet laureate of the United States. Wow. One of mine will be in there too. Wow. It's too early for the book to be promoted much. So if you're interested, you may want to find and follow either David or Homebound Publications here online. And of course, that would be homeboundpublications.com or David Caleff, which is DAVIDKLEFF.com. Okay. Thanks for the information and the inclusion, David. And good luck with that project. Can't wait to see it when it comes out. Now, if all this talk about poetry has stirred you into a poetic mood yourself, and you think, hey, I could write something, but you might need a little prodding or maybe a little background information on poetic form without being bored by background on poetic form, I recommend The Ode Less Traveled, Unlocking the Poet Within by Stephen Fry. Nothing to do with Thoreau, but I mean, how can you resist it just on the title alone? The Ode Less Traveled. Talks about every kind of format, including the difference between a Shakespearean sonnet and a Petrarchian sonnet. And so if you didn't know about iambic pentameter before I told it to you, you'll find it in here along with all of the other patterns. Anyway, that's great. And you know what? I think that wraps up our topic of poetry for today. Again, all of the books that I mentioned, including The Ode Less Traveled, will have links at travelswiththoreau.com. And don't forget about David's forthcoming book next year and follow along with that. So thanks again for joining me in this series of studying Thoreau. I hope my comments about poetry were helpful to you. And again, if you've been moved by Henry and Walden and the whole mystique around that to write, yay, you go do it. And let us know how that goes and publish it, for heaven's sakes. So my next topic will be quote books. Over the years, there have been a ton of books published with examples of Thoreau's quotes in them. And actually, you know, you could make a case that The Winged Life and The Poet's Delay are quote books too, but they're more poetry oriented, especially when Robert Bly is involved. And they are not going to appear in the next episode, so get your fill of them now. There are many quote books to talk about. I will not talk about each and every one of them, but there, you know, some are better than others, as we've learned with other resources. In the meantime, feel free to subscribe to this channel, ring the bell up at the top to get notices. If you liked it, do a little thumbs up, leave a comment, I'll respond. And that's where we're going from here. There are a lot more topics to cover, amazingly enough. We never get tired of talking about Henry David Thoreau. Till next time then, thanks a lot. I'm Corinne Smith. Take care.